The book I chose to read was Grit: Why Passion and Resilience Are the Secrets to Success by Angela Duckworth. This book was all about how important it is to have grit because that is what makes one successful in life. Duckworth said that grit is made of passion and perseverance and did countless studies and interviews about grit. She studied 1,200 West Point students, National Spelling Bee qualifiers and winners, and interviewed numerous successful people, including the Seattle Seahawks, their coach Pete Carroll, and Anson Dorrance. The book was split up into 3 different sections: what grit is and why it matters, growing grit from the inside out, and growing grit from the outside in. In the first section, what is grit and why it matters, the first chapter is about showing up and never giving up. Grit is about consistency over time, no matter the obstacle or successes encountered. Grit is also about effort, and Duckworth actually has an equation for effort counting twice. Talent times effort equals skill, and skill times effort equals achievement. While talent is important, if one can persevere through anything and gain skill, and then use that skill and effort together, that's where achievement will happen. Duckworth also talked about grit growing, and you can grow grit internally and externally. In the second section, growth from the inside out, that was all about internal factors of grit. These included interest, practice, purpose, and hope. Interest is key in grit because you can work hard at something and stick to it, but if you aren't interested in it, you are less likely to be motivated in it. Practice is important because this plays into the endurance part of grit. Practice makes something permanent because practice makes you do something over and over again. With interest, the repetition will never get boring and you will only get better at what you are trying to accomplish. Purpose plays into the goals that grit contributes to. People have many goals in life, some short-term, some long-term. The importance with purpose is that there is one main purpose you are trying to achieve. All the smaller goals in your life should lead you to your one main goal or purpose. Finally, hope is important for grit because hope gives you a positive mentality. Growth mindset, where you believe you can grow your grit, optimistic self-talk, and perseverance over adversity all put together equal hope. Personality matters in grit because it is not just a physical output, but also a mental input within oneself. In the third section, growing grit from the outside in, this section talks about the culture of grit that one lives in. As a parent, it is important to be demanding, but also warm and loving to encourage a gritty culture. It is also important to establish a culture of grit in extracurricular activities. 2 people who really establish a culture of grit are Seattle Seahawks coach Pete Carroll and the University of North Carolina women's soccer coach Anson Dorrance. Grit is part of character, and character is plural. This is saying that grit, passion, perseverance, and many other things within oneself. The third section is what will most likely affect my classroom. Duckworth conducted so many studies on grit. She studied 1,200 West Point students to see how gritty they were. Not only did she study their scores they brought into West Point and their physical ability, she also looked at their extracurricular activities in high school to see if they were involved and how long they stuck with something. This shows that the endurance part of grit. The results from this study showed that students who were more involved were grittier, as they were all on about the same level playing field with their scores, seeing as West Point only accepts the best. She also studied qualifiers and winners of the National Spelling Bee. She studied how long they study for and what they study, and their results. This study showed that students who studied more for longer were grittier, and were also more successful. She then studied high school students and what they were involved in and for how long they were involved. The results of this study showed that these students who were more involved and stayed in things longer had more endurance and were therefore grittier and also more successful once they got a job in life. She studied the Seattle Seahawks football team after their coach saw her TED Talks and called her and said that he was fostering a culture of grit. She studied what they did at practice and at games, which was they did their best and always finished strong to build endurance, resilience, positivity, and ultimately, grit. I was mind blown by the actual data behind her studies and how important grit is for success. This book really opened my eyes to how gritty I am, not just because I took her grit test, but also because everything she said that was important and worth doing is what I do. I will contribute this to the culture my parents created for me, which was very gritty. For this reason, grit is built into me. My students may not be as gritty as me, but as Duckworth says, grit grows. I can grow the grit in my students. I can definitely apply this book to my classroom, and I plan to. Here's how. First, I will be caring. I will care about what my students are interested in and encourage them to get involved and stay involved with things that are related to what they are interested in. I will care about them more than just as a student. I will foster an environment in my classroom that encourages learning and critical thinking so my students can grow in education and in themselves. I will also foster a gritty classroom community, like Anson Dorrance fosters a gritty team community for the women's soccer team at North Carolina. Anson Dorrance is the head women's coach, and he is the most winning coach in history. He led the U.S. women's national team to their first title in 1991. To foster a gritty community, he has his players fill out the grit scale every spring to see their changes and also evaluate themselves so they can become the best they can be. He also does the BEAT test, which is a running endurance test. This is not only physical, but also a mental test to see how far his players will push themselves. The third thing he does is make sure that the team's values are the same, which they are. Half of the values of the team are teamwork, and the other half are grit. Side note, I adore Anson Dorrance, and until I was a sophomore in high school, I wanted to play for him. So I plan to use his grit culture in my classroom. With this in mind, I will have my students do a grit test every year so they can see themselves grow. I will also have values in my classroom so that students see the value of grit and learning every day when they walk in the room. Another thing I will do in my classroom is to focus on the learning that is done and how it is learned, and not on the materialistic outcomes such as grades. I will do this through feedback on my students' papers so they know how they are learning and can see how to work and make changes and be successful. Finally, I will model grit for my students through my hard work and my perseverance. This will help establish the classroom community I want and help my students to succeed.